Welcome to Follow Action. I had to get the car to pass roadworthy, and this is everything I had to do for it to pass. Okay, so this engine runs now. In order to pass roadworthy, there were a number of things that had to be fixed. So first of all, the front lower ball joints had torn boots, so I replaced those. The lower boot and upper boot, so both ball joints were replaced on both sides, so on that side too. And then the other thing that they complained about was that, according to them, my rear trailing arm bushes. So this is the rear axle, this is the trailing arm, and obviously one on the other side, but that bush in there, according to them, is torn. It just makes these little lines where the rubber is like just slightly worn and the dust collects on them, and according to them that is a torn boot if there's dust collected on it. So I still have to do it, but I'm just going to wash them pretty much, and then they should be fine. Then the other thing, where the front leading arms mount onto the chassis, so this is the front leading arm for the suspension, where this mounts onto the chassis, this piece of plate here was bent. It was like it basically touched that steel collet thing. So I just bent that down, and they called that the gearbox mount. So yeah, so that's fixed. And then the other thing was that they complained about, basically on the bottom of the sump where the gearbox and the sump joins, there's like little droplets of oil over there. There's some over there. They said the engine has an oil leak, which is in fact correct. It does have an oil leak, and that was the valley gasket. Right down there in the bottom, in the valley of the V8, there's a gasket that sits there that basically it functions as the intake manifold gasket and the valley gasket all in one. So that gasket was leaking, and yeah, so the job was to replace that gasket. So this is a compression test we did. So the first value is before, that's also before, and then the second value is after. So on cylinder 1, so that's before we did the head gasket replacing, and that's after we replaced the head gaskets, and we put in ARP head studs and not the normal Land Rover stretch bolts, which are shit. So cylinder 1 stayed about the same. Cylinder 2 went from 93 to 110 psi. So cylinder 2 definitely had a combustion leak. I think that leak was from cylinder 2 into cylinder 4. So cylinder 2 went from 93 to 110, cylinder 3 115 to 108, so that's slight decrease, but that's not an issue at all. Cylinder 4's compression increased by quite a lot. Cylinder 5 was about the same, also just a slight decrease, no big deal. Okay, but cylinder 4, it definitely had a bad compression leak out to atmosphere. And then cylinder 6, also a slight decrease, but not an issue. Cylinder 7 roughly the same, and cylinder 8 roughly the same. So yeah, new L-ring head gaskets and ARP head studs, which made a big difference, and basically a lot of cleaning. Like the whole top end of this engine was assembled with silicone. They used the right gaskets and stuff, but everything was just put together with silicone. One of the things I did, so usually so the crankcase and top end vacuum on this engine, usually how it works is over here. You can see there's this rubber hose that goes in here, and it enters the intake manifold before the throttle body. So that's just before the throttle body sits in here. So it just enters like right there, just before the throttle body. And then, so this is the modified section now, but usually there's a hose that runs from here and goes into this nipple here. So usually what happens is you have vacuum in this section, and not really so much vacuum, but still filtered air in this section. So it'll draw air out of the engine crankcase and top end. Air will be drawn out here through this hose and into this nipple, and then it goes through the intake manifold, and then it gets burnt, and air gets sucked into this hose and then into the engine. So it basically circulates through the air filter, goes into the engine there, runs down through the bottom of the engine, comes back up, comes out this hose, goes into the intake manifold, and then gets burnt in the engine. But that causes an exceptionally dirty intake manifold, and it's not that great for the inside of your engine. It causes a lot of carbon buildup and shit. So basically, one of the mods that I did was, instead of having this hose actually connected, I'm just venting this to atmosphere. So there's going to be a slight vacuum here, but very emphasis on slight, because it's just basically the resistance that the air filter causes is going to cause a slight bit of vacuum there, and then it should draw some air in here into the engine. But in practice, this vacuum isn't really much at all. So basically what happens here is it's slightly smoking when the engine is hot, but that's just like oil vapors and stuff coming out here. But I'm waiting to see if it makes everything around it oily, but it hasn't yet, and I've driven about 500 kilometers now with the engine since the like head gasket job, and since I've done this, and there's no oil buildup on any of this so far. So it seems like so far I'm quite happy with that. One of the other things that I did is I neatened up these heater hoses. So the heater hoses are supposed to go in there. So usually this hose comes out of the lower intake, runs there, goes into that tube, and then it returns. Does it return this way? Yes, it does. And then it returns back down here, and then goes in here, and then down into this hose that runs. It's mounted over here. But both of these, that's a steel hose. This is also a steel hose. But so I've bypassed the heater core, because the heater core leaks, and then the driver footwell gets full of coolant. So that's been bypassed. But before I had like just a little like rubber tube that was kinked all nasty. It didn't look that great, and these hoses are rusted to shit inside. So I've cut them way shorter. So this one has been cut down to here, and this one, the steel hose usually came up here and then went up to about here. So all of that steel has been cut out, and it's just a rubber bypass now. But the idea is, because this is an aluminium block and aluminium radiator, and then just a slight amount of steel coolant pipes, it causes galvanic corrosion on the steel, and then the steel all rusts to shit. That's why you can see, like, you see how eaten away that hose is, and this one is the same. So later idea is to replace all of the steel hoses with aluminium. Then that won't happen anymore. And then the other thing is these exhaust. Usually it had exhaust shields that covered all of it. So there's a shield. Oh, it's terrible lighting here. But there's a shield that sits between the back of the manifold, exhaust manifold, and the engine block. And then there used to be another shield that sat over in front of the exhaust manifold. So I've basically wrapped the exhaust manifold in fiberglass tape, and then just removed the external exhaust shield. So I've kept the internal one, so it'll keep heat away from the block, and the same on the side. Here you can see that back, the rear exhaust shield, a bit better. There it goes, runs down there and then over there too. But my main reason for that is those things are, especially on the driver's side, which is that side, those shields are a bitch to get on and off, and they have small like M6 bolts that break off every time, so you pretty much have to replace them. And yeah, I just don't feel like doing that. So I kept the rear shields, and I just wrapped the headers, and then removed the front heat shields. But this process now was just to get this engine in a like reasonable condition and running decently well. Once the series body is on here and that car's driving, then this engine is going to get the full rebuild, and then I'll do stuff like ceramic coat basically the whole head. So ceramic coat the valves inside the ports, and then have the exhaust manifold, all the exhaust manifold ceramic coated, have the top of the piston ceramic coated. That makes a huge difference in heat, like heat inside the engine. It makes it so that all the heat can actually get out the exhaust and not sit around here in the engine bay. So that should be a big improvement in that department. So that's why I'm not really too worried about it, is keeping the exhaust shields and stuff, because I'm going to have it all ceramic coated. And the other thing is this. So this is like this hose over here also joins in the top of the lower intake manifold in the coolant passage, and the coolant temp sensor sits right next to it. I'm not sure if you can see it in there. No, not really. But this hose, its main job is to keep air bubbles away from the coolant temperature sensor, and that nipple was a steel inserted nipple into the lower intake, and it was also rusted to shit. So I drilled that out and tapped it to, what is it, 1/8 inch BSPT thread, and then screwed in one of these type of nipples in there. Screwed like one of those in there and replaced this hose, because that hose was rock hard. So this hose, normal routing goes through here and then round underneath there and then into the bottom of the coolant bottle, but as you can see, it's already quite plastered here. So I basically routed it under the intake manifold and then round the back there and then up into the bottom of the coolant bottle. This hose has also been replaced. This one's job is to keep air bubbles out of the radiator over here. So this hose just runs down here under the front here and then down there and then comes up here. Yeah, so that, and it's like, okay, tidying up like the engine harness and stuff. Like, well, my brother redid all this like wrapping. You see how nicely this is all wrapped now. Looks a lot better than it did. There used to be like here, there was a bundle of like completely exposed wires that sat there, and it's all like nicely wrapped up now, protected. It basically looked like that, like a bundle of wires like that was just rubbing on the aluminium itself. So that was quite asking for problems. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So I still basically just have to wash the underside of the car, and then I'm going to take it for roadworthy probably on Friday, which is 2 days away from now, and then hopefully it passes. So yeah, that's it.
So I took Plizzy in for roadworthy on Friday afternoon, and they did the inspection and stuff, and they like checked under the car and said everything is good. And then the lady took the car for a drive outside on the road, and then she came back, and I was sitting and waiting outside, and then I asked her, so did the car pass? And she said, no, sorry, the brakes didn't work. And like I shat myself a little bit. I was like, oh, for fuck's sake. And then she's like, no, I'm joking. And so yeah, the car passed, and it's deemed roadworthy for South African roads. So yeah.